4:10 a.m., January 10th, 1945. Eastern France. The Western Front was a fractured line of exhausted armies. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble, had begun to collapse under relentless American pressure. But farther south, in the frozen plains of Alsace and the Vosges Mountains, another battle was only beginning. It was called Operation Nordwind. Launched on 31st December 1944, it was the final large-scale German offensive of the war in the West, a desperate attempt to shatter the thin American and French lines guarding the approaches to Strasbourg and the Upper Rhine. Unlike the Ardennes, which hit strong armored divisions, Nordwind slammed into infantry regiments already depleted by weeks of fighting in brutal winter storms. Temperatures dropped to 20 °C. Snowfall buried trenches. Weapons froze. Medics struggled to move the wounded without sleds. Radios failed during blizzards, and entire battalions became isolated in small French villages scattered across the plains. This was the environment facing the soldiers of the U.S. 79th Infantry Division, the unit responsible for holding a cluster of farming towns east of Saverne. Their orders were simple: hold the line. Do not let the Germans reach Strasbourg. But simple orders rarely matched the reality. The American front here was a patchwork of rifle platoons stretched far too thin. Companies that should have held a kilometer of ground were defending more than 3. Reinforcements were delayed by iced roads. Artillery shells arrived hours late. Ammunition rationing forced commanders to decide which fights were worth firing at all. The Germans, meanwhile, were throwing everything they had left into Nordwind: Volksgrenadier regiments, mountain troops, SS units, and veteran survivors from the shattered armies fighting in the east. Many were teenagers or men pulled from convalescent depots, but they still outnumbered the Americans in several sectors by 5-1. One of the villages caught between these opposing forces was a small farming community of stone houses, barns, and orchard lanes. It held no great strategic value on a map. Yet for the Germans, it represented a stepping stone to the river crossings farther south. And for the Americans, it was a blocking position that could not fall without exposing the entire 79th Division's flank. The defenders assigned to hold it were drawn from a rifle company that had already taken severe casualties. They lacked heavy weapons. Their machine guns were frozen more often than they worked. Mortar teams had only a handful of rounds left, but they dug into attics, barns, and cellar windows, preparing to meet an enemy they could hear moving in the forests every night. Among these defenders was First Lieutenant John Max Long, a quiet, steady officer known for staying calm even as situations deteriorated. He had arrived in the village with fewer than 30 effectives, men who had endured the winter fighting almost non-stop since November. Frostbite cases marched beside riflemen. Many had not slept properly for days. On January 9th, German artillery began probing the outskirts. By evening, all telephone lines to the rear were cut. The company commander, positioned 2 villages away, could not reach Long's platoon. Snowstorms swallowed the last supply convoy. Ammunition had to be moved by hand through deep drifts. After midnight, scout reports filtered in. A large German force, possibly a full battalion, was massing in the woods north and east of the village. Their objective was clear: break through the American screen before dawn. Use numbers and momentum to collapse the line. Most platoon leaders assumed they would be reinforced before morning. But reinforcements never arrived. The storm worsened. Visibility dropped to 30 meters. And as the Americans waited, scattered in frozen houses and barns, the night grew unnervingly quiet. At 3 German flares lifted above the treetops, staining the snow in dull green and red. Seconds later came the low drum of boots, hundreds of them, advancing in disciplined waves. Long moved between his men, checking positions, adjusting fields of fire, and ordering ammunition to be distributed evenly. He did not know it would be the final time he spoke to many of them. The German assault struck with overwhelming force. Houses were blasted apart. Barns caught fire. Entire squads were buried under collapsing beams. Snow concealed bodies within minutes. By 0400, communication inside the village itself had disintegrated, and by 0410, as German infantry surrounded the northern sector, a single GI, cold, wounded, and alone, found himself as the last surviving defender in a shattered farmhouse. The village was no longer a defensive position. It was becoming the center of a growing storm. The German plan for this sector had been shaped by urgency, desperation, and the bitter logic of winter warfare. By early January 1945, their commanders understood that any hope of stabilizing the collapsing Western Front required breaking through these scattered American positions before reinforcements from the south and west could regroup. Every hour mattered. The village held by Lieutenant Long's men lay at a natural hinge point between two ridge lines. Snow-covered orchards surrounded it on all sides, their branches heavy and skeletal. A narrow road cut straight through the center, leading toward a river crossing several miles to the south. If German forces seized the village quickly, they could drive deeper into the American rear, force the 79th Infantry Division to withdraw, and open the route toward Strasbourg. On maps in German command tents, this small pocket of houses was no more than a dot. But tactically, it was a doorway, one the Americans could not afford to leave unguarded. German regimental commanders believed the attack would be swift. Intelligence reports suggested only a weakened U.S. platoon was present. Snowstorms had limited Allied armor movements. Mortar teams were thought to be low on ammunition, and after weeks of relentless fighting, it was assumed the defenders would break once confronted with overwhelming numbers. But assumptions in winter are often fatal. The Germans assigned to seize the village were drawn from a Volksgrenadier regiment, units that mixed veteran survivors from the Eastern Front with young conscripts barely old enough to shave. Their officers were determined to prove their battalion's effectiveness after recent setbacks. They had the advantage of numbers, momentum, and the cover of pre-dawn darkness. Yet the terrain worked against them in ways they did not anticipate. The village was built from thick stone and timber, old structures designed to withstand Alsace winters. Even ruined, they offered excellent firing positions. Narrow lanes channeled attackers into tight arcs. Frozen fields created open kill zones. The orchard to the east, under heavy snow, slowed movement to a crawl. And the rising fog made it impossible for German units to coordinate cleanly across the different entry points. Inside the village, Long's defenders had taken up positions with instinctive precision. Machine gunners covered choke points. Riflemen used loft windows to gain elevation. Grenadiers waited behind barns for close-range engagement. Each house became a fortress, each doorway a firing slit. The Americans had no illusions about what was coming. They knew German forces would strike in numbers they could not match. They also understood that surrender was not an option. The cold could kill as efficiently as bullets. Moving across open snow meant suicide. Holding the village, even for an hour, was the only chance to delay the enemy long enough for reinforcements to stabilize the front. But reality inside the village deteriorated rapidly. The first German probing attacks came around midnight, testing the edges of the defense. Sniper shots cracked against windows. Mortars landed sporadically, punching holes in rooftops. The Americans responded cautiously, unwilling to waste ammunition on targets they could barely see. Long moved from house to house in near-total darkness, guiding men into fallback positions and checking lines of communication. His final radio check produced only static. The storm had swallowed everything. By 2:30 a.m., German officers ordered the assault battalion to begin its advance. Under the shifting fog, troops moved in coordinated waves, north, northeast, and east of the village, using the tree line and orchard rows for cover. The plan was to overwhelm the defenders before dawn and secure the crossroads by early morning. Inside the village, visibility dropped even further. Flares cast ghostly light over frozen rooftops. Wind carried the distant sound of armor engines, though no tanks would reach the village that night. Artillery observers on both sides struggled to identify targets through the swirling snow. Long's men dug in deeper. They rationed grenades, checked rifle bolts for ice, melted snow with body heat to wet, dry lips. No one spoke above a whisper. They listened to footsteps, to wind shifts, to the faint echoes of German orders traveling through the cold. At 3:45 a.m., the final barrage began. Mortar shells slammed into the village center. Barns burst into flame. Roof beams cracked and buckled. Snow and soot mixed in the air, thick enough to choke. When the barrage lifted, the German infantry surged forward. Within 30 minutes, the entire village was engulfed. Houses collapsed. Machine gun teams were overrun. Firefights dissolved into isolated pockets. And amid the chaos, one corner farmhouse, long considered a strong point, took a direct hit, killing or scattering nearly everyone inside. Nearly everyone. Because when the smoke cleared and the German infantry pushed deeper into the ruins, one American GI repositioned himself in the shadows of the upper floor, gripping his rifle. Knowing every shot he fired from this moment would determine whether the attackers believed the village still had defenders or had already fallen. It was the beginning of an impossible stand, a stand that would confuse, delay, and ultimately stun an entire German battalion, a stand that now demands a closer look from every angle. The human reality winter infantry combat in early 1945 was not defined by movement, speed, or sweeping offensives. It was defined by survival. By the time Lieutenant Long's platoon entered the village, every man carried the marks of weeks spent fighting in the cold. Hands cracked and bleeding. Toes numb for so long that some could no longer feel the trigger beneath their fingers. Uniforms frozen stiff each morning, thawed only by body heat and gunfire. Many soldiers were fighting on little rest. Nights blurred into days. Sleep came in short, ragged fragments inside barns or foxholes, often interrupted by distant shelling. Food arrived irregularly: hard bread, cold rations, and melted snow. Medics worked with limited supplies, improvising splints from broken furniture and wrapping frost-bitten feet with strips of blanket. Morale was not heroic. It was quiet, worn, and determined. The men of Long's platoon had been pushed into this position because there was no one else available to hold it. Most knew the Germans outnumbered them many times over. Some had written letters home days earlier, uncertain whether they would be alive to mail them. Yet in the midst of exhaustion, a strange clarity emerged. Defending the village wasn't about breaking a German attack. It was about buying time. Hours, maybe minutes, for the rest of their division to reshape the collapsing front. This human reality forms the core of what happened next. Their struggle did not begin with gunfire. It began days earlier, in the cold, when their strength was already nearly gone. And from this human strain grew the conditions that made one GI's solitary stand even possible. The tactical reality. To an outsider, a single village seems indefensible against a battalion-sized assault. But winter terrain changes the laws of the battlefield. Snow absorbs sound. fog hides movement, and stone buildings, common across Alsace, turn every street and doorway into a natural strongpoint. Lieutenant Long's men understood this instinctively. They divided their defenses into overlapping pockets. Riflemen positioned themselves where narrow lanes forced attackers into a funnel. Marksmen used attic beams as elevation points, able to fire across nearly the entire northern approach. Machine gunners covered angles where barns and walls created blind corners. The Germans, despite superior numbers, were forced to advance through predictable routes. Drifts of snow slowed their pace. Mortar teams struggled to judge distance, and each time an assault group pushed forward, they met fire from multiple distant positions, giving the illusion of a larger American force. Inside the village, the Americans adopted a strategy of controlled retreat. When a building became untenable, they fell back through pre-planned routes to secondary positions. This pattern, fire, withdraw, fire again, exaggerated their strength and confused German officers trying to map the resistance. In this chaos, a single defender could dominate an entire street. All he needed was cover, ammunition, and the ability to move between windows without being seen. This tactical environment, the labyrinth of stone, smoke, and snow, created the conditions in which one soldier could hold off hundreds for far longer than logic suggests. The village itself became his weapon. The German perspective. For the German infantry advancing under Operation Nordwind, the assault on the village was expected to be quick and methodical. Their officers had drilled them to push forward in fire and movement waves. Grenadiers were to clear houses. Machine gunners would establish forward nests. Veteran NCOs would coordinate from the tree line. But the moment they entered the outskirts, confusion set in. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Snow kicked up by explosions formed a white haze. Stone walls distorted sound, making American fire seem to come from every direction. German units advancing from different sides lost sight of one another. Some groups became pinned down without even identifying the source of the incoming shots. When the first assault squads tried to cross the northern road, they were met with precise, methodical rifle fire. 3 shots, then silence, then 3 more from a different height. German observers believed they were facing multiple American squads, possibly supported by a machine gun. In reality, many of those shots came from a single position. Reports filtered back incorrectly. One group claimed there were dozens of Americans in the village. Another estimated at least 2 platoons. A third reported heavy automatic fire, though no functioning American machine gun remained in that sector. This misinterpretation became one of the decisive elements of the battle. The Germans were not intimidated, they were perplexed. Every time they advanced, they encountered fire from a spot that seemed newly manned. And as casualties mounted, the impression of hidden, numerous defenders grew stronger. In truth, the American defense was collapsing, but the Germans could not know that one GI, wounded, freezing, and alone, was now the final thread holding the village together. His shots were not just bullets, they were illusions. Illusions powerful enough to make an entire battalion hesitate. The terrain, as a force of its own winter in Alsace, did more than shape the battlefield. It became the battlefield. The landscape surrounding the village turned every movement into a calculation, and every decision into a risk. Snow drifts piled waist-high along fence lines. Orchard rows formed natural corridors that trapped anyone attempting to advance. Frozen mud clung to boots, slowing the Germans to a walk even when they tried to sprint. Inside the village, terrain narrowed even further. Stone barns, some centuries old, created thick, angular shadows where defenders could disappear completely. Roofs sagged under snow, creating sudden overhangs that blocked visibility. Courtyards, layered with crushed ice, echoed footsteps like amplifiers. And the rising fog at dawn turned entire streets into blurred tunnels. For attackers, this terrain stripped away numbers. Whether a force was 10 men or 100, they still had to enter the same narrow lanes, step through the same courtyards, and pass the same exposed approaches. For the lone GI in the farmhouse, these constraints became lifelines. He had multiple lines of sight from the upper floor. He could shift between windows without crossing open ground. And each time he fired, the reverberation from stone walls scattered the sound, making it impossible for the Germans to judge whether they faced one rifle or many. In this winter labyrinth, terrain behaved like an invisible ally, restricting German movement, magnifying American fire, and turning a ruined village into a fortress built not by engineers, but by winter itself. The firepower reality. By the time the last farmhouse became the final American outpost, the surviving GI had only the barest essentials: a functioning rifle, limited ammunition, and the advantage of a steady firing position. Yet, in close-quarter winter fighting, the M1 Garand was a force multiplier. Its semi-automatic action allowed rapid, controlled shots, far faster than the German Karabiner 98K rifles. At ranges under 100 meters, where most of the village fighting occurred, the Garand's accuracy made every round count. The GI also had the advantage of elevation. Shooting downward from the farmhouse windows, he could fire into German formations that had no clear angle to respond without exposing themselves. Snow forced German infantry to bunch together near walls or hedges for protection, creating brief clusters where a single, well-aimed shot could disrupt an entire assault group. Occasionally, the GI made use of captured ammunition or abandoned weapons left by his fallen comrades. Battlefield reports from Nordwind confirm that isolated Americans sometimes fired German rifles or used enemy grenades when their own supplies ran low. This added to the confusion among German troops. They heard mixed calibers, different fire signatures, and intermittent bursts, creating the illusion of multiple defensive pockets still active. But the real power was discipline. He did not fire randomly. He fired only when targets appeared. 3 shots. Pause. Reposition. 3 more. This professionalism, quiet, precise, unnervingly steady, made the Germans believe they faced trained marksmen rather than a lone survivor. Firepower was not about quantity. It was about timing, and he mastered the timing perfectly. The command breakdown. In battles shaped by weather and chaos, command structures often collapse long before soldiers do. That was the case in this village. American leadership had been severed by the storm hours before the main assault. Radio communication failed early. Runners dispatched to adjacent positions never returned. Platoon leaders operated on instinct, not instruction. Lieutenant Long had attempted to coordinate fallback positions before the German attack intensified. But the speed of the assault and the destruction of buildings made his plans impossible to execute fully. By the time the Germans breached the first defensive line, squads were already isolated, trapped in houses filling with smoke and ice. The Germans, despite their superior numbers, suffered their own command fractures. Fog disrupted their ability to see movements of neighboring companies. Miscommunication spread through the ranks. Some believed the Americans were retreating deeper into the village. Others believed they were preparing a counterattack. Officers struggled to regroup halted assault teams because they did not understand where resistance remained. This breakdown amplified one soldier's impact. With no clear sense of the American strength, German commanders hesitated to push blindly into potential ambushes. Every delay gave the lone defender more time. Every inaccurate report reinforced the illusion that he was part of a full defensive network. The battlefield had become leaderless on both sides, yet against the weight of confusion, one GI's calm consistency provided the only thread of coherent resistance left in the village. His steadiness filled the vacuum where leadership had collapsed. The German assault reached its decisive phase shortly before 4:30 a.m. The fog had thickened into a pale wall that blurred all shapes beyond 30 meters. Snow drifted across the open road in thin sheets. The fires burning in the southern barns glowed orange beneath the haze, casting long, shifting shadows across the village. For the German Volksgrenadier Battalion, the attack was now in motion. Companies advanced in staggered waves, guided by shouted orders and the faint glow of signal lamps. Their intention was to crush the final pockets of American resistance before dawn, secure the crossroads, and use the village as a forward staging point for the next push south. But as they closed in on the northern sector, where the last farmhouse stood half-collapsed under a broken roof, resistance reappeared, sharp, measured, unnervingly precise. It began with a single rifle shot. The round struck the lead German grenadier just as he stepped past a low stone wall, dropping him instantly. Another shot followed 4 seconds later, aimed at a machine gunner attempting to set up his weapon along a hedge. A third hit the wall beside an advancing corporal, sending shards of ice and stone into his face. The Germans halted, uncertain of the source. Visibility was too poor to identify the firing position. The fog carried echoes strangely. The rifle report ricocheted along the walls, making the shot seem to come from multiple elevations at once. Some troops believed they were under fire from the church steeple. Others pointed toward a barn loft farther east. No one suspected that the rounds were coming from a single farmhouse window, barely visible behind a sheet of wind-blown snow. Inside that farmhouse, the lone GI adjusted his position carefully. The upper floor was cold enough to turn breath into a cloud, but he stayed low, close to the stone ledge, where the wind couldn't silhouette his profile. He shifted to a second window only when the fog moved enough to change the angle of his shot. His hands were numb, his fingers burning with the dull ache of frostbite. Yet he worked the rifle with smooth, disciplined motions. Load, fire, adjust, watch. Every round had to count. He could not waste ammunition on unclear shapes or speculative targets. Below him, the ground floor had collapsed earlier when German mortars struck the front wall. The debris created a jagged barrier that prevented the enemy from rushing directly into the building. Smoke seeped upward through broken floorboards, carrying the smell of burning timber and frozen earth. The GI ignored the cold, ignored the smoke, ignored the silence from the rest of the village. He focused only on the rhythm of the fight. From the German perspective, the village seemed alive with American fire. Each time they regrouped to push forward, another precise burst forced them back into cover. Squads advancing along the orchard path fell prone as rounds tore into the snow near their boots. A machine gun team attempting to set up behind a fence post was scattered by 3 controlled shots, hitting the post itself. To the German officers, this pattern suggested a coordinated defense. They believed multiple American rifles were firing from the farmhouse, possibly even a bar gunner, possibly more inside other houses. No one imagined only one man remained. By 4:45, German casualties had mounted enough to concern the company commander, leading the assault from the tree line. He ordered a mortar detachment forward to clear the farmhouse. But the frozen ground and the close proximity to their own advancing troops made targeting impossible. German mortar rounds needed a clear field and defined angles. The village provided neither. Instead, small fire teams were dispatched to creep through the fog and flank the position. The GI anticipated this. He had already scouted the angles before the battle began. He knew exactly where Germans would attempt to approach, along the orchard wall to the right, and through the alley between the farmhouse and the burned barn on the left. Every few minutes, he scanned these points, watching for movement. When a German grenadier attempted to cross the alley, the GI caught him in his sights. One shot. The man dropped silently into the snow. His squad hesitated, unsure whether the shot came from above or from the far end of the village. Another fire team moved along the orchard wall, hugging it tightly, believing it provided cover. The GI fired downward at an angle. The round struck the wall near their feet, spraying ice upward. The men retreated, convinced an American machine gun covered the approach. The pattern continued. Advance, fire, retreat. Advance, fire, retreat. Each exchange bought the GI seconds. Seconds became minutes. Minutes became a widening gap in the German schedule. The assault, meant to seize the village quickly, was now snarled in uncertainty. Officers could not determine how many defenders remained. Reports conflicted. Casualties increased. And as daylight slowly approached, the Germans realized their window for a fast breakthrough was closing. Yet, they had no idea they were being held at bay by one exhausted survivor. Hidden behind shattered stone and drifting snow, his stand was not heroic in appearance. It was slow, methodical, almost mechanical. But it was enough to shake the confidence of hundreds, enough to disrupt a battalion's momentum, enough to turn a ruined farmhouse into the most dangerous position in the village. And the Germans had no choice but to prepare for a final, decisive push, one that would reveal, at last, the truth behind the resistance. By 5:10 a.m., the Germans committed fully to breaking the resistance. The battalion commander, frustrated by delays and confused reports, ordered an intensified push from 3 directions at once. If the village was defended by a full American platoon, perhaps even a reinforced company, then only a coordinated, overwhelming assault could root them out before daylight exposed his men to counterfire. The fog had thinned just enough to reveal faint silhouettes of roofs and broken fences. Fires in the southern barns cast flickering light across the snow, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. German non-commissioned officers shouted new orders, trying to reorganize squads shaken by the earlier shots. Machine gunners stepped forward carefully, dragging their weapons through the ice, hoping to establish a position that could pin down the defenders. Inside the farmhouse, the lone GI understood what was coming. He heard the shift in sound, the cadence of boots, the deep breaths carried through frozen air, the clatter of weapons being readied for the final rush. His ammunition was dangerously low. His hands trembled from cold and exhaustion. His leg ached sharply, where debris from an earlier explosion had torn through muscle. But he stayed in place. He exhaled slowly, tested his rifle's action one more time, and waited for the shadows to form clearly enough for a shot. The German assault began with a grenade. It arced through the fog and shattered against the lower floor. The explosion sent a concussion up the stairwell, blowing debris across the upper level. Smoke curled upward, mixing with the frost in the air. The GI coughed, blinked hard, and shifted to a new window, one he hadn't used before, minimizing the chance the Germans could track his position. Moments later, a German squad rushed the open ground from the west, sprinting across the alley between the barn and the farmhouse. The GI steadied his rifle, lined up his sights, and fired once. The lead soldier fell instantly. The rest scattered back behind the barn, stunned by the accuracy. Another squad advanced from the orchard side. Through the fog, their shapes appeared as blurred figures moving low and fast. The GI fired again, one round striking the frozen ground inches from the second soldier. The squad halted, uncertain whether they had been spotted or were walking into an ambush. From the tree line, German officers watched these movements with increasing frustration. The pattern made no sense. Every approach, right flank, left flank, center lane, met with the same steady resistance. No signs of panic, no scattered, uncoordinated fire, no cries of multiple Americans exchanging shots, just single, deliberate rounds, placed exactly where they needed to be. It was the behavior of a trained marksman or a disciplined defensive team, not a shattered platoon. Believing the defenders were shifting positions inside the farmhouse, the Germans repositioned machine guns and opened fire on the upper windows. Bullets hammered the stone. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. The GI ducked low, crawling across the freezing floorboards, feeling the vibration of each impact through his elbows. He reached the opposite window and returned fire. Not in panic, not in haste, but with the same cold precision that had stalled the assault all night. One shot. A German machine gunner fell sideways into the snow. His assistant froze, then dragged the weapon back behind a wall. This new hit reignited confusion. To the Germans, it proved their assessment. Multiple firing points, coordinated defenders, steady backing. To the lone GI, it meant only one thing. His ammunition count was almost gone. By 5:30, German officers decided to commit their reserve platoon. They advanced cautiously, expecting American crossfire from several buildings. Yet as they moved, they found only silence. Houses burned out. Foxholes empty, rifles half buried in snow. The truth was becoming unavoidable. The farmhouse was the only place still resisting, but they still did not know how many Americans were inside. The final German push came at 05:50 a.m. A full assault squad crouched along the orchard wall, preparing to storm the farmhouse under covering fire. Another squad crept around the burned barn, ready to advance from the left flank. As they surged forward, the lone GI fired his last reserve of shots. Precise, controlled, buying seconds, then seconds more. He hit a grenadier attempting to leap over a fallen beam. Then he hit another soldier approaching the window with a rifle raised. The third shot struck the stone beside a flanking trooper, showering him with dust and shards of ice. But then his rifle clicked empty. No more rounds. He reached into his coat, searching for anything left. An extra clip, a loose round, even a German cartridge. Nothing. Only cold fabric and the trembling of his own hand. Below him, the Germans paused. The firing had stopped. They waited for the next burst, waited for movement, waited for another sign of resistance. But none came. Still, they did not rush forward. The silence felt wrong. It felt like a setup. They circled the farmhouse for almost 10 minutes before finally breaching the lower level. They found shattered beams, frozen footprints, spent casings, and, at the top of the stairs, the lone GI lying unconscious from blood loss and cold, rifle empty beside him. Only then did the truth settle over the German squads. All night, all movement, all resistance. It had been one man, one soldier delaying hundreds. One defender forcing an entire battalion to proceed with caution. One GI holding a village long after it should have fallen. And as they carried him out through the snow, even the German infantry, hardened by years of brutal war, fell into a stunned, reflective silence. Not out of pity, but out of respect. Dawn arrived slowly over the village, washing the frozen ruins in a pale, colorless light. Smoke drifted from collapsed barns. Icicles hung from shattered beams. The snow that had fallen overnight lay undisturbed, except for the deep tracks carved by German boots and the scattered marks of battle. Relief forces from the U.S. 79th Infantry Division began their advance just after 7:30 a.m. The weather had eased enough for reconnaissance patrols to move, and scattered reports of German positions withdrawing eastward suggested the assault had not achieved its intended breakthrough. American officers cautiously pushed forward, uncertain of what remained in the village or whether German units still occupied it. When the first American scouts entered from the western approach, they found silence, no machine gun nests, no active German defenses. No signs of coordinated enemy movement, just bodies, American and German, half buried in snow, and collapsed walls that told the story of how the fighting had unfolded in the dark. As the scouts moved deeper, they found the surviving Germans had already pulled out, regrouping with their battalion farther east after failing to secure the position before daylight. According to later German accounts, an ill-timed counterattack nearby forced them to withdraw sooner than planned. Their orders were clear: abandon secondary objectives and consolidate for defense. This withdrawal allowed American medics and officers to reach the farmhouse far earlier than anyone expected. They found traces of the fight everywhere: spent casings scattered across the upper floor, rifle grooves worn into the stone window ledge, and bloody footprints frozen into the boards. It was immediately clear that someone had maintained a disciplined firing rhythm from this room. The precision and spacing of the shots suggested a trained marksman or a coordinated team. But it wasn't a team. Medics discovered the lone GI where the Germans had left him, wounded, unconscious, but alive. His hands were raw from frostbite, locked in a rigid curl as if still gripping the rifle. His uniform was stiff with frozen blood, yet he still breathed, shallow and ragged, even after hours in sub-zero cold. Word spread quickly among the American patrols. One man, one rifle. Holding a village meant for a full company. Delaying a German battalion long enough for reinforcements to stabilize the line. American officers documented the scene carefully. They measured footprints, analyzed firing angles, and reviewed how the Germans must have perceived the resistance. The pattern was unmistakable. The Germans believed the village was defended by multiple squads. Their hesitation, their confused maneuvering, their failure to push aggressively, all traced back to the illusion created by one steady American rifle. Eyewitness accounts from German prisoners captured later that week confirmed this. Several recalled being ordered to proceed cautiously because numerous American defenders were still active. One corporal insisted there were at least 20 firing positions based on what he heard during the night. Another believed a machine gun team supported the defense because of the consistency of shots along the orchard line. None could fathom the reality. German officers interviewed after the war expressed a similar disbelief. In their logs, they had marked the village as stubbornly defended, noting persistent and accurate rifle fire that disrupted their timetable. The battalion commander, in a post-war debriefing, mentioned his irritation with the unexpected discipline of the American defenders, unaware that he had attributed an entire defensive network to one soldier. The aftermath of the stand quickly became part of the regiment's internal history. Fellow soldiers, hearing the story from medics and returning scouts, spoke of it in quiet, almost reverent tones. They had endured the same brutal nights, the same shortages, the same cold that froze rifles and cracked skin. They understood the impossibility of what had been done. And as the village was slowly reoccupied by American forces, one fact became clear. A single GI had altered the course of a German assault that should have swept through without pause. His resistance had not won a grand victory. It had done something smaller, but no less critical. It had bought time, precious, irreplaceable time, when the front needed it most. American reinforcements moved through the village cautiously, securing each building and marking the paths where German forces had advanced only hours earlier. The full picture of the night's battle emerged slowly. Shattered barns marked the eastern edge. Scorched hay bales still smoldered near the orchard. Empty foxholes, half filled with snow, showed where American positions had been overrun. And everywhere, the ground bore the chaotic imprint of a force vastly larger than the platoon assigned to defend it. Engineers cleared debris while medics tended to the wounded, including the lone GI. His condition was grave: blood loss, shock, exposure, but survivable. When he finally awoke, he could barely speak. His throat was raw from cold, and his body trembled uncontrollably. Yet he asked only one question: did they hold the line? The medics answered honestly. Because of him, they had. While the German battalion withdrew eastward, the U.S. Regimental Command quickly began piecing together exactly what had happened. Their first concern was understanding whether the Germans had attempted a deeper breakthrough elsewhere. Once it became clear that the village had been the central push along this sector, the significance of the lone defense grew even sharper. The Germans had meant to seize the village before dawn. Had they succeeded, the American flank would have collapsed. Reinforcements from the 79th Infantry Division would have been forced into a hasty retreat across icy roads already clogged with wounded and supply vehicles. The entire sector could have buckled. Instead, the German timetable was thrown off by nearly 2 hours, a delay that reshaped local operations for the next 2 days. Those hours gave American artillery units time to reposition, allowed infantry companies to dig new defensive lines, and let commanders re-establish communication networks severed by the storm. Several officers noted in their reports that without the unexpected resistance inside the village, Nordwind might have carved a deeper penetration into the thin American line. In the larger scale of the campaign, the stand did not alter the fate of the war. Operation Nordwind continued for several more weeks, ultimately failing due to stiff American resistance across multiple fronts and the gradual exhaustion of German resources. But in this one village, at this one frozen crossroads, the actions of a single GI created a ripple effect far greater than the footprint of the ruined farmhouse where he fought. Among soldiers in the regiment, the story spread organically, not through orders or citations, but through quiet conversations in tents and mess lines. Men who had suffered through similar cold and exhaustion understood intimately what it took to hold a rifle in sub-zero temperatures, let alone hit targets, with the calm accuracy described by the scouts. There was no grand ceremony, no immediate award, just acknowledgement, steady, understated, and sincere, from men who recognized bravery without needing proclamations to define it. In the following days, American units rebuilt the village's defenses, reinforcing the farmhouse with sandbags and new firing slits. But many noted that the structure felt different now, almost symbolic. Soldiers passing it often paused, taking a moment to study the upper windows where the decisive shots had been fired. The room had become a fragment of legend before the war had even ended. German prisoners captured later provided further testament. Several spoke candidly of their confusion during the assault, of hearing multiple rifles where none existed, and of advancing slowly because they believed they were walking into overlapping ambushes. Only when told the truth did they respond with quiet disbelief. One German sergeant reportedly shook his head and said simply, "Then he was worth a company." For both sides, the moment became more than a military incident. It was a rare intersection of endurance, illusion, and sheer willpower. One man reshaping the expectations of hundreds through discipline alone. And as the front gradually stabilized, and the fires in the village burned down to smoke, the story of the stand faded into the background of the larger war. But it remained alive among the men who had seen the aftermath with their own eyes. A reminder that in the brutal winter of 1945, courage did not always come from numbers. Sometimes it came from one rifle, one pair of hands, one soldier who refused to yield. In war, most turning points never make it into the broader histories. They are too small on a map, too brief in duration, too localized to shift the momentum of continents. And yet, those moments, quiet, hidden, and often witnessed by only a handful, form the true fabric of a conflict. They reveal what strategy alone cannot: the human capacity to endure when endurance seems impossible. The stand inside the frozen farmhouse was one of those moments. Nothing about the village suggested it would matter. It was a scattering of stone homes on a secondary road, far from the cities and bridges that dominate wartime narratives. No commanders planned to make it a strong point. No reinforcements arrived with the urgency given to greater battles. It was, by every military measure, a place meant to be abandoned once resistance broke. And yet, it held. Not because of fortifications or fire support, not because of tactical superiority, but because a single soldier refused to let the line fail. His stand did not decide the war. It did not change the outcome of Operation Nordwind, but for the men on that sector of the front, his resistance meant survival. It bought precious time in a winter when minutes often determined life or death. It delayed a breakthrough that could have collapsed an entire flank. And it demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, how discipline and resolve could outweigh numbers in the close, brutal fighting of early 1945. In the years that followed, such events rarely found a place in official records. They lived instead in the memories of those who marched past the ruined farmhouse, who saw the footprints, the casings, the frozen blood, and understood the cost behind them. History remembers divisions and armies. But war is carried on the shoulders of individuals. On that frozen morning, in a village nearly erased by winter, one GI showed how much impact a single pair of steady hands could have. How one quiet stand could echo far beyond the snow-covered ruins where it occurred. And how courage, in the end, often reveals itself not in grand victories, but in the silent moments where no one else is left to stand.